Millionaire sees his pregnant ex-wife collapse on the street. What happens next will shock you. The streets of Manhattan buzzed with life, the symphony of horns, chatter, and hurried footsteps weaving the usual fabric of the city. James Caldwell strode purposefully down Fifth Avenue, his tailored suit and polished shoes a testament to the empire he had built. The cold wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed, his mind preoccupied with numbers and contracts. He glanced at his watch, a pristine Rolex, and noted he was ahead of schedule for his next meeting. Despite the sheen of success that surrounded him, there was a hollowness in James that even he struggled to define. It was the kind of emptiness that crept into quiet moments, the ones when the world stilled and his thoughts became inescapable. For years he had chalked it up to the cost of ambition, a price he had willingly paid. Yet recently it felt less like a cost and more like a chasm swallowing him whole. He paused at the corner of Madison Square Park, allowing a stream of pedestrians to pass. His gaze drifted across the park's landscape, the bare trees stark against the grey winter sky. And then he saw her. A figure stumbled near the park bench, clutching her side as she crumpled to the ground. It was a scene most might overlook in the city's chaos, but James felt an inexplicable pull. His breath caught in his throat as he moved closer, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't yet understand. As he approached, the woman's features came into focus, a cascade of auburn hair, pale skin flushed with strain, and the curve of her face etched into his memory. It was Clara. Clara. He whispered, the name foreign on his tongue after so many years. The last time he had said it was during their divorce, his voice filled with resignation, hers with heartbreak. Her head tilted weakly in his direction, and their eyes met. Even through the haze of exhaustion clouding her gaze, recognition flickered. "James," she murmured, her voice barely audible, before her eyes fluttered closed. Panic surged through him as he knelt beside her, shaking off the disbelief that threatened to paralyze him. "Clara, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice cracking. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, relieved to find a faint but steady pulse. "Call 911, he barked at a bystander who fumbled with their phone. Without waiting, James scooped Clara into his arms. She felt lighter than he remembered, almost fragile, as if life had worn her down. The cab ride to the hospital was a blur. James barely registered the driver's grumbles about the urgency of his request or the icy streets that mirrored his churning thoughts. All he could focus on was Clara, her shallow breathing, the lines of fatigue etched into her face. At the hospital, nurses whisked her away, leaving James in the sterile waiting room, his hands gripping the edge of a plastic chair. The walls, painted a pale green meant to soothe, only heightened his unease. Minutes felt like hours, and his mind raced with questions. What had happened to her? Why was she here alone in this state? And why hadn't she told him about the pregnancy he now suspected? When the nurse finally emerged, James rose so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "How is she?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. "She's stable," the nurse replied. "She's exhausted and dehydrated, but she and the baby are going to be okay." The words hit him like a freight train. Baby. His mind reeled as he tried to process the revelation. Clara, pregnant, and with no one by her side? The nurse's next words broke through his thoughts. "She's asking for you." James entered the room cautiously, the soft beep of monitors and the hum of fluorescent lights amplifying the tension. Clara lay propped up on the hospital bed, her eyes half open. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. "I wasn't expecting you," she said weakly, her voice tinged with both vulnerability and defiance. James hesitated, the weight of their history pressing down on him. He moved to the chair beside her bed, sitting down slowly. "I wasn't expecting to find you like this," he replied, his tone softer than he intended. Clara's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" James nodded, unable to tear his gaze from her. He had faced boardrooms filled with skeptics and investors demanding answers, but here, in the presence of the woman he once loved, he felt utterly unprepared. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the baby. About everything." Clara's hand tightened around the blanket, her eyes clouding with emotion. "And what would you have done, James? Put me on your to-do list? Schedule a meeting to discuss it between mergers and acquisitions?" Her words stung, but he knew they were deserved. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't know what I would have done," he admitted, "but I would have been there." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Finally, Clara sighed, her expression softening. "Maybe I didn't want you to be there, not then. But now I don't have a choice." James reached out, his hand hovering over hers, before finally settling on the edge of the bed. "You do have a choice, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "And so do I." Her eyes met his, searching for the sincerity she had once doubted. In that moment, something shifted between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but a fragile thread of understanding. And for the first time in years, James felt a spark of hope. The sterile hum of the hospital lingered in the air as James sat by Clara's bedside, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. In that moment, something shifted between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but a fragile thread of understanding. And for the first time in years, James felt a spark of hope. The sterile hum of the hospital lingered in the air as James sat, but the room was eerily quiet, save for the soft beeping of the heart monitor. His mind churned with questions he wasn't sure how to ask. He hadn't been this close to Clara in years, yet the weight of her presence felt as familiar as it was foreign. Clara stirred, her fingers twitching slightly against the hospital blanket. James straightened in his chair, his heart pounding as her eyes fluttered open. The light overhead cast a faint glow across her face, highlighting the shadows under her eyes and the fragile curve of her cheekbones. She looked like she carried the weight of the world and more. "James," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said quickly, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" She blinked slowly, as if piecing together her surroundings. "Like I've been hit by a freight train," she replied, her dry humor still intact despite her condition. A small, relieved smile tugged at James's lips, but it vanished as his gaze drifted to her belly. His throat tightened, the words he had been holding back now impossible to suppress. "Clara," the nurse said. He faltered, searching her face for a reaction. "She said the baby is okay." Clara's expression changed instantly, her hand instinctively moving to rest over her stomach. The gesture was protective, almost defensive, and it made James's heart ache. "They told you," she said softly, her eyes avoiding his. "Clara." He leaned closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call?" His voice broke slightly, and he forced himself to steady it. "I should have known." Clara let out a quiet sigh, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the blanket. "It wasn't that simple, James," she said finally, her tone weary. "We weren't exactly in a place where I could just pick up the phone and say, 'Hey, by the way, I'm pregnant.'" James stared at her, guilt twisting in his chest. He thought back to the day she walked out of his life, her voice trembling as she told him she couldn't compete with his ambitions. At the time, he had been too consumed by his work to truly understand what he was losing. Now, sitting here, the reality of what he had missed, what he had been oblivious to, hit him like a tidal wave. "You should have told me anyway," he said, his voice quieter this time. "I would have been there." Clara's eyes snapped to his, a flicker of anger breaking through her exhaustion. Would you really have been there, James? Or would you have sent a check and gone back to your board meetings? The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely untrue. The James of 5 years ago might have done exactly that, convincing himself it was the best way to provide for her. But now, seeing her here, vulnerable and carrying his child. He realized how hollow such a gesture would have been. "I don't know what I would have done then," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But I know what I want to do now." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent battle of wills between two people who had loved deeply and lost just as profoundly. Finally she looked away, her fingers curling tighter around the blanket. "I didn't want you to feel obligated," she said after a long pause. "I've made it this far on my own. I've handled everything, or at least I thought I could." James felt a pang of sadness as he noticed the crack in her voice, the unspoken struggles she had endured alone. "You shouldn't have had to," he said softly. "Not alone." "Clara, this is my responsibility too." Her gaze returned to him, softer this time but still cautious. "And what does that mean, James? Are you planning to swoop in and fix everything? Buy your way into being part of this?" The words were sharp, but they weren't meant to wound. James could see the fear behind them, fear of being let down again, of opening herself up only to be hurt. He couldn't blame her for that. "No," he said firmly. "I don't want to buy anything. I just want to be here. For you, for the baby, for whatever you need." Clara's expression wavered, and for a moment James thought she might shut him out again. But then she sighed, the fight in her eyes giving way to something more vulnerable. "I don't know if I can trust you, James," she admitted quietly. "Not yet. I understand," he replied, his voice steady. "But let me prove it to you. Let me be here this time." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of things left unsaid, of wounds slowly beginning to heal. Finally, Clara nodded, the smallest of gestures, but it was enough to give James hope. He didn't expect forgiveness overnight, but for the first time in years, he felt like they were taking a step, however small, in the right direction. As the tension eased, a nurse entered the room with a clipboard. "We'll need to run a few more tests to make sure everything's on track," she said. "It might be a while." James stood, stepping aside but not leaving. "I'll wait," he said, meeting Clara's eyes briefly before turning back to the nurse. Clara watched him, her heart a mix of emotions she couldn't yet untangle. As the door clicked shut behind the nurse, she let her head rest back against the pillow, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. For the first time in a long time she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. James returned to the hospital the next morning, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. It was a simple gesture, one he hoped wouldn't feel out of place or overbearing. The flowers reminded him of Clara, of the quiet afternoons they'd spent in her tiny studio apartment, surrounded by the scent of her favorite candles and the hum of her painting playlist. Those memories, now tinged with regret, felt like relics of a life he barely recognized as his own. When he entered the room, Clara was sitting up in bed, absently flipping through a magazine she didn't seem to be reading. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she looked more alert than the night before, though the shadows under her eyes hadn't disappeared. She glanced up at the sound of the door and froze for a moment, her gaze flicking to the bouquet in his hand. James hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of himself. "Too much?" he asked, holding up the flowers with a sheepish smile. Clara raised an eyebrow, but didn't suppress the small smile tugging at her lips. "Not your usual style, but I'll allow it." He stepped into the room and placed the flowers on the small table beside her bed. "I figured it was time to break from tradition," he said lightly, pulling a chair closer to her bed. "How are you feeling?" Clara shrugged. "Better, I guess. They're keeping me another day or two for observation. Apparently, collapsing in public is frowned upon." James winced at her self-deprecating tone. "You scared me," he admitted. "When I saw you—" He trailed off, his voice thickening. "I didn't know what to think." Clara's expression softened, but she quickly masked it with a wry smile. "Well, I'm not planning on making a habit of it." Silence settled between them, and James found himself studying her, searching for the right words. There was so much he wanted to say, but everything felt too big, too weighted for this fragile moment. Instead, he started small. "Do you need anything? From home, I mean. Clothes, books, anything at all?" Clara hesitated, her fingers grazing the edge of the blanket. "I've got everything I need," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "I'm used to managing on my own." "That doesn't mean you have to," James replied, leaning forward. "Let me help, Clara. Not just now, but moving forward." Her eyes met his, wary and guarded. "What does that mean exactly? Are you offering to be some kind of part-time dad?" "Because I don't need charity, James." "It's not charity," he said quickly. "It's responsibility. And more than that, it's what I want. I don't want to just send checks or drop by when it's convenient. I want to be involved." Clara frowned, her expression tightening. "You say that now, but what happens when your company demands your attention, when your board needs you? You've always been good at making promises, James, but keeping them, that's another story." Her words stung, but James didn't flinch. He knew she had every reason to doubt him. Still, he couldn't let her push him away, not this time. "I've changed, Clara," he said quietly. "Or at least, I'm trying to. I know I screwed up before, and I can't undo the past. But I can be here now, for you, for the baby. Let me prove it." Clara studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as if trying to discern the truth in his words. Finally she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "What are you proposing exactly?" James exhaled, relieved that she was at least willing to listen. "Move into my place," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Just until the baby is born. You shouldn't have to worry about anything: rent, groceries, hospital bills. Let me take care of it." Clara's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "James, I can't just move into your penthouse and play house. That's not how this works." "I'm not asking for that," he said quickly. "This isn't about us getting back together. It's about making sure you and the baby are safe and cared for. Nothing more." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the bouquet of lilies. "It's not that simple." "I know," James said softly, "but nothing about this is simple, Clara. And that's okay. We'll figure it out, together." For a moment she didn't respond, and James's heart sank, the weight of her silence almost unbearable. But then she turned back to him, her expression still guarded, but tinged with something else, something softer. "I'll think about it," she said finally. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. James nodded, a small spark of hope flickering in his chest. "That's all I'm asking." Later that afternoon, James stepped outside the hospital to take a call. The brisk air bit at his face, and the noise of the city filled the space around him. The call was from his CFO, demanding his attention on an upcoming deal. He answered briskly, his tone sharp and efficient as he juggled details about profits and projections. But even as he spoke, his mind was elsewhere on Clara, on the fragile hope of rebuilding something he had thought was lost forever. When the call ended, he stared at his phone, the bright screen reflecting his conflicted expression. For the first time in years, the numbers and deals felt insignificant. All that mattered was upstairs in a hospital bed, carrying the child he never knew he wanted. As he re-entered the hospital, James made a silent vow. He wouldn't let her down again. Whatever it took, he would prove to Clara and to himself that he was capable of being the man she and their child deserved. James's penthouse stood starkly silent as he paced the living room, waiting for Clara's arrival. The polished marble floors reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a testament to his meticulously curated life. Everything in the space, from the abstract art on the walls to the sleek minimalist furniture, spoke of wealth and success. Yet, as he waited, the pristine surroundings felt cold and hollow. He glanced at his watch for the third time, anxiety gnawing at him. Clara had agreed to move in temporarily after much persuasion, but her agreement had come with a clear warning. "This doesn't mean I'm relying on you. It's for the baby, James." When the doorbell finally rang, James almost tripped over his own feet in his rush to answer it. He pulled the door open to find Clara standing there, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her auburn hair was tied back, and she wore a simple coat that looked too thin for the chilly weather. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "Hi," James replied, stepping aside to let her in. His gaze flicked to her stomach, now more noticeable beneath her sweater. "Let me take that," he offered, reaching for her bag. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the strap before she finally let him take it. "Thanks." As she stepped inside, her eyes swept over the space, taking in the sprawling living room and the glittering skyline visible beyond the windows. James watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. "This is different," Clara said finally, her tone neutral. "A lot bigger than I remember." James couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a criticism, but he chose not to press. "It's just a place," he said, setting her bag down by the couch. "What matters is that you're comfortable." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. For a moment, James saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with, the quiet dreamer who had once painted cityscapes with such vivid emotion they felt alive. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass. James stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. "I used to think so," he admitted. "Now I'm not so sure." Clara turned to him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, the vulnerability of the moment catching him off guard. "It's just all of this. Everything I've built, it doesn't feel as important as it used to. Not when I think about what I lost to get here." Clara's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding in her eyes, but she quickly looked away, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "We all make choices, James," she said quietly, "and we live with the consequences." Her words were a gentle rebuke, but they carried no malice. Still they stung, a reminder of how deeply he had hurt her. The days that followed were a delicate dance of boundaries and tentative connection. Clara settled into the guest bedroom, a space James had hastily prepared with soft linens and fresh flowers. She spent most of her time reading or sketching in a notebook she kept close, her movements careful and deliberate. James respected her space, but he couldn't help stealing glances at her whenever they crossed paths. One evening he found her in the kitchen, a faint hum escaping her lips as she prepared tea. The sound caught him off guard, pulling at a memory he hadn't visited in years. "You still hum when you're focused," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Clara looked up, startled. "I didn't realize I was," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's nice," James said, his voice soft. "I used to love hearing it when you painted." Clara's hand stilled on the teapot, her eyes flicking to him. "That feels like a lifetime ago." "It does," James admitted. He took a tentative step closer. "But some things don't change." Clara didn't respond immediately, her gaze dropping to the counter. "Maybe," she said finally, "but we're not those people anymore, James." "I know," he said, his tone earnest, "but that doesn't mean we can't try to be better." That night, James couldn't sleep. He found himself in his study, staring at the collection of books he had amassed over the years. His success had been built on strategy and negotiation, on his ability to read people and situations. Yet, when it came to Clara, he felt like a novice, fumbling in the dark. As he thumbed through a leather-bound journal he had once used for notes, a loose page slipped out. It was a sketch one Clara had drawn during a lazy Sunday morning years ago. The image was simple, the two of them sitting together on a park bench, her head resting on his shoulder. She had captured the warmth of that moment with stunning accuracy, the lines delicate but purposeful. James stared at the sketch, his throat tightening. He remembered that day vividly, the way the sunlight had filtered through the trees, the sound of her laughter as they shared stories about their dreams. It had been one of the last times he had felt truly content. Folding the sketch carefully, he slipped it back into the journal. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope not just for reconciliation, but for a chance to build something new. The next morning, Clara found James in the kitchen, a small breakfast spread laid out on the counter. She paused in the doorway, her eyes widening slightly. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, stepping closer. James shrugged, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "I figured it's the least I could do." Clara hesitated before taking a seat. As she reached for a slice of toast, she glanced at him. "Why are you doing this, James? Really?" He met her gaze, his expression serious. "Because I want to. Because I care about you. And because I don't want to make the same mistakes again." Clara studied him for a long moment, her fingers grazing the edge of her plate. Finally she nodded, her expression softening. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's see where this goes." It wasn't a declaration or a promise, but it was a start. And for James, that was enough for now. The quiet rhythm of their days together began to settle into an uneasy routine. Clara spent her mornings sketching at the small desk James had set up in the guest room, while James continued running his company from the home office. They shared meals occasionally, their conversations tiptoeing around the fragility of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, a subtle warmth began to creep into their interactions. James noticed the way Clara's guard would lower, if only slightly, when she spoke about her plans for the baby. Clara, in turn, observed how James softened in her presence, his sharp edges dulled by the genuine effort he made to connect. It was during one of these moments of tentative closeness, a quiet evening over tea in the living room, that the storm finally broke. Clara sat on the plush couch, her legs tucked beneath her as she cradled a steaming mug of chamomile tea. The faint strains of jazz played from the speakers, the soft melody filling the spacious room. James sat across from her, his sleeves rolled up and a faint smile on his lips, as he listened to her talk about her art classes. "I've been thinking," Clara said, setting her mug down. "Once the baby's here, I might want to start teaching again. Not full-time, but just enough to feel like I'm contributing something." James nodded, leaning forward with genuine interest. "That's a great idea. Your students always adored you." Clara's lips quirked into a small smile, a rare softness in her expression. "It's not about them adoring me. It's about purpose, I guess. Feeling like I'm part of something bigger." "You are," James said quietly, his gaze steady. "You've always been." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Clara looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. Before she could respond, James's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sharp sound shattered the moment, and he instinctively reached for it. "Sorry," he muttered, glancing at the screen. His expression shifted instantly, the faint warmth in his eyes replaced by a cold, calculated focus. "What is it?" Clara asked, her tone cautious. James hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's a work thing. I'll deal with it later." Clara's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in her gaze. "Is it about that project you mentioned? The development deal?" James's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Yes," he said finally. "It's nothing you need to worry about." But Clara wasn't convinced. "James, what's going on? You've been dodging calls all week. Is something wrong?" "It's fine, Clara," he said, his tone clipped. "Just business." The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that James wasn't telling her the whole truth. The following afternoon, Clara found herself alone in the penthouse, her curiosity gnawing at her. She told herself it wasn't about mistrust, it was about understanding. James had been acting strange lately, and she needed to know why. Wandering into his office, she hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was impeccably organized, a testament to James's meticulous nature. On the desk, a sleek laptop sat open, its screen dark but not locked. Clara's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let her walk away. Taking a deep breath, she tapped the touchpad, and the screen lit up. A document was open, its title glaring back at her, Madison Heights Development Proposal. Clara's eyes scanned the contents, her heart sinking with each line. The project James's company was spearheading wasn't just any development. It was a massive urban renewal initiative that involved demolishing several community centres and affordable housing complexes, including the one where Clara had been teaching art classes for underprivileged kids. Her stomach churned as the realization sank in. James had known. He had to have known. And yet, he hadn't said a word. The sound of the front door opening jolted her out of her thoughts. Quickly, she closed the laptop and stepped out of the office, her pulse racing. When James walked into the living room, Clara was waiting for him, her arms crossed and her expression tight. "Clara," he said, sensing the tension immediately. "What's wrong?" She didn't waste time. "Why didn't you tell me about the Madison Heights project?" James froze, his face paling slightly. "Clara, I can explain, can you?" She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Because it looks like your company is planning to tear down the community I've been working with for years, and you didn't think to mention it." "I didn't know the details," James said quickly, his tone defensive. "It's a massive project. I delegated it to my team." "That's not good enough, James," Clara snapped. "You're the CEO. You're responsible." "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice rising. "Do you think I wanted to hurt you? To hurt anyone?" "But you did," Clara said, her voice breaking. "And you didn't even care enough to find out how. You've been so focused on fixing things between us that you didn't stop to think about what your actions might mean for me or for the people you're affecting." James took a step closer, his expression pleading. "Clara, please, let me make this right. I'll stop the project. It's not about stopping the project," she interrupted, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's about trust, James. How can I trust you when you keep things like this from me?" Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he was silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet, almost broken. "I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying to be better, but I can't change overnight." Clara stared at him, her heart aching with the weight of their shared pain. "I know you're trying," she said softly, "but maybe trying isn't enough." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the living room, the distance between them feeling impossibly vast. This chapter marks a turning point in their relationship, as James is forced to confront not only his mistakes, but the deeper flaws in his priorities. Clara, meanwhile, must grapple with her own fears of vulnerability and whether she can truly trust him again. Their journey is far from over, but the seeds of transformation have been planted. The tension in the penthouse was palpable, a heavy silence stretching between James and Clara like an unbridgeable chasm. Days had passed since their argument, yet the words they had exchanged still lingered, raw and unhealed. James had tried to approach her, to explain himself, but Clara had kept her distance, retreating into the guest room and the sanctuary of her thoughts. For James, the silence was unbearable. He had always been a man of action, someone who could fix problems with logic and determination. But this wasn't a deal to negotiate or a crisis to manage. This was Clara, someone he had already let down too many times, and this time he wasn't sure if an apology would be enough. One morning, James left the penthouse early without telling Clara. He had spent the night poring over documents related to the Madison Heights project, tracing its origins and realizing just how blind he had been to its consequences. The reports and proposals were filled with statistics and projections, but they failed to capture the human cost, the lives that would be upended, the communities that would be erased. Determined to see the situation for himself, James drove to the neighborhood in question. The streets were alive with the chatter of children playing and the hum of life in a tight-knit community. The buildings, while old and worn, stood as symbols of resilience and history. He parked his car and stepped out, his polished shoes feeling out of place on the cracked pavement. As he walked, he saw the art center Clara had mentioned, a modest building with colorful murals painted on its walls. The scenes depicted families, culture, and a sense of togetherness that was far more vibrant than anything his skyscrapers could ever offer. A woman greeted him at the entrance, her eyes wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I'm just visiting," James said, his voice uncertain. "I've heard a lot about this place." The woman eyed him for a moment before nodding. "We've been hearing a lot, too, about how this place might not be here much longer." Her words stung, but James forced himself to nod. "That's why I'm here, to understand." The woman hesitated, then motioned for him to follow her inside. The art center was small but filled with life children painting at easels, teenagers practicing dance routines, and adults gathering for a community meeting. James watched in silence, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him with every passing second. Later that evening, James returned to the penthouse, his mind racing. Clara was in the living room, her sketchbook open on her lap. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. "Clara," he said softly, walking toward her. "I went to Madison Heights today." Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I needed to see it for myself," he said, sitting across from her, "to see what I've been blind to." Clara set her sketchbook aside, her hands resting on her lap. "And what did you see?" she asked, her voice measured. "I saw people, families, children living their lives, building something real. I saw the art center you've been working with. It's incredible, Clara. What you've done there it's beautiful." Her lips pressed into a thin line and she looked away. "It's not about me, James. It's about them, about the lives that will be destroyed if this project goes forward." "I know," James said, his voice firm. "That's why I've decided to shut it down." Clara's head snapped back toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "I'm stopping the project," he repeated. "I've already contacted the board. It's going to cost us a lot, but I don't care. I can't let this happen. Not now, not ever." For a moment, Clara simply stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of shock, relief, and something she couldn't quite name. "James, why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and because I need you to know that I'm not the man I used to be. I've made mistakes, so many mistakes, but I want to do better. For you, for the baby, for myself." Clara's gaze softened, her defenses cracking just enough to let his words sink in. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I can see that you're trying. And that means something." James nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and relief. "That's all I'm asking for, Clara, a chance to prove to you that I can be the man you need me to be." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Clara spoke. "You know, when I first found out I was pregnant, I was terrified, not just because of the baby, but because I didn't know if I could do it alone. I thought maybe it was better that way, better than risking being hurt again." James's throat tightened, guilt washing over him. "You'll never have to do it alone, Clara. Not anymore." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to believe you, James. I really do." "Then let me show you," he said, his voice steady. "Not with words, but with actions." Clara nodded slowly, a small but significant gesture. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, a fragile thread of hope, weaving its way through the fractures of their past. The next day, James called an emergency board meeting to formally announce the cancellation of the Madison Heights project. The decision was met with resistance, but James stood firm, his resolve unwavering. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a choice that truly mattered, one that aligned with the person he wanted to become. Back at the penthouse, Clara began to let her guard down, allowing James to be more involved in her day-to-day life. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, asked questions about the baby, and even took an interest in her sketches. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to crumble. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Clara handed him a small piece of paper. It was an ultrasound image, the tiny figure of their baby barely visible. James stared at it, his chest tightening with emotion. "It's incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled softly. "It is. In that moment, something shifted between them, a fragile but undeniable connection, built on the promise of a new beginning. They weren't there yet, but for the first time, James and Clara felt like they were walking the same path, and for both of them, that was more than enough. The days began to blend into a quiet rhythm, one marked by tentative conversations and shared moments that slowly chipped away at the icy distance between James and Clara. While trust was still fragile, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them, a cautious willingness to believe in the possibility of something better. For James, every interaction with Clara felt like both a gift and a test, and he approached each one with care, knowing that a single misstep could undo all the progress they had made. But he wanted more. He wanted Clara to see that he wasn't just trying to repair the broken pieces of their past. He was building something entirely new. Late one night, James sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him. The faint glow of his laptop illuminated his face as he pored over old photos of Clara's artwork, saved from their earlier days together. Her talent was undeniable, but what struck him most was the raw emotion she captured in each piece. Every brushstroke told a story, stories he had once been a part of, but had been too blind to appreciate. His gaze drifted to a recent sketch she had left on the coffee table, a delicate drawing of the Madison Heights Art Center, surrounded by smiling children. It was simple yet powerful, a testament to her unwavering connection to the community. He stared at it for a long moment before picking up his phone. "Gotch," he said, when his assistant answered groggily. "I need you to pull some strings. It's important." A week later, Clara returned to the penthouse after a long day of running errands, her hand instinctively resting on her growing belly as she stepped inside. She kicked off her shoes and was halfway to her room when she noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter, her name written in James' familiar scrawl. Frowning, she opened it and pulled out a thick piece of cream-colored paper. It was an invitation to a private gallery opening in her honor. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the details. The event was scheduled for the following evening at one of the city's most prestigious galleries. Beneath the formal wording, James had written a personal note. "Clara, this is for you, for your work, your passion, and the incredible impact you've had on so many lives. I hope you'll let me celebrate you the way you deserve." Clara stared at the note, her emotions swirling. She wanted to feel touched, but a part of her bristled at the idea that James might be trying to buy her forgiveness with a grand gesture. Still, curiosity and something deeper drew her to the idea of seeing what he had planned. The next evening, Clara arrived at the gallery, her steps tentative as she walked through the glass doors. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that hugged her growing belly, her auburn hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. The space was buzzing with quiet excitement, a mixture of familiar faces from the art world and unfamiliar ones she assumed were James's business associates. James stood near the entrance, his sharp suit tailored to perfection, but his expression softened the moment he saw her. He approached slowly, his hands in his pockets as if trying to make himself less imposing. "You came," he said, his voice filled with quiet relief. "I wasn't sure I would," Clara admitted, her tone cautious. "But I'm here." James nodded, his gaze searching hers. "Thank you. There's something I want to show you." He led her through the gallery, where her paintings and sketches were displayed with breathtaking precision. Each piece was beautifully framed, lit to highlight the depth and emotion of her work. Clara's breath caught as she saw the care that had been put into the curation. These weren't just her most well-known works. They included pieces she had never shared publicly, sketches James must have kept from their time together. At the center of the gallery was a large canvas, her most recent piece, the one of the Madison Heights Art Center. Surrounding it were photos of the community members she had worked with, children smiling beside their paintings, families gathered for events, and even a snapshot of Clara herself, laughing as she helped a child mix colors. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the display, overwhelmed by the love and thoughtfulness behind it. "James," she began, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his expression earnest. "Clara, I know I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I want you to know how much I see you, your talent, your heart, everything you've given to the people around you. You deserve to be celebrated, not just for the incredible artist you are, but for the person you've always been." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she felt like he truly understood her, not as a means to an end, but as someone deserving of love and recognition. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself drawn into conversations with attendees who praised her work and expressed genuine admiration for her contributions to the art world. For the first time in years, she felt seen not just as an artist, but as someone who mattered. When the event began to wind down, James approached her, his expression tentative. "Can I walk you home?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The walk back to the penthouse was quiet, the crisp night air wrapping around them like a cocoon. When they reached the building, James held the door open for her, his hand brushing hers briefly. Inside, Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "James, thank you for everything tonight. It was beautiful." "You're beautiful," he said softly, the sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them electric. Finally Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we're not as broken as I thought." James' breath hitched, and he took a cautious step closer. "Clara, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if you'll let me." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze searching his. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand, her touch both tentative and full of promise. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread of hope weaving its way through the fractures of their shared past, offering the possibility of something new, and for the first time in years they both dared to believe it could be enough. The weeks following the gallery opening were filled with cautious hope and quiet progress. James and Clara fell into a new rhythm, one built not on the forced pleasantries of their early days together, but on shared understanding and growing trust. For the first time in years, the walls they had carefully built around their hearts began to come down. James threw himself into proving his commitment, not with grand gestures, but with steady, meaningful actions. He accompanied Clara to her doctor's appointments, taking notes with meticulous care and asking questions that showed how deeply invested he was. He spent his evenings helping her prepare the guest room for the baby, listening as she dreamed aloud about the life she wanted to build. For Clara, the change in James was undeniable. The man who once seemed consumed by ambition now spoke about balance, about priorities that extended beyond boardrooms and bank accounts. While she was still cautious, she found herself softening toward him, letting him in piece by piece. One evening, as they sat on the couch, James handed Clara a small velvet box. She froze, her heart racing. "James, what is this?" "It's not what you think," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "Just open it." With hesitant fingers, Clara opened the box to find a delicate silver bracelet inside, its charm engraved with a tiny tree. She looked at him, puzzled. "It's a tree of life," James explained. "I thought it symbolized growth, resilience, and new beginnings. Things I think we both need." Clara's throat tightened as she held the bracelet. "James, this is thoughtful, beautiful," he smiled, relief washing over him. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you of how strong you are, how much you've overcome." Clara slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, her fingers brushing the charm. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope not just for herself, but for them. Months later, on a crisp spring morning, Clara went into labor. James was a nervous wreck, pacing the hospital hallways, while Clara labored with a calm determination that left him in awe. When the moment finally came, and the soft cry of their baby filled the room, James felt something inside him shift irrevocably. The nurse handed him the baby, a tiny, perfect girl with a tuft of auburn hair, and James's hands trembled as he held her. "Eleanor," he whispered, the name Clara had chosen. She's incredible. Clara, exhausted but radiant, smiled from her hospital bed. She is, and she's ours. James looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. Clara, I promise you I'll never take this for granted. I'll never take you or her for granted. Clara reached out and touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I believe you, she said softly. And for the first time she truly did. The months that followed were challenging, filled with sleepless nights and the chaos of adjusting to life with a newborn. But amidst the exhaustion and the uncertainty, James and Clara found something they hadn't felt in years, a sense of partnership. James took to fatherhood with an enthusiasm that surprised even himself. He learned to change diapers, mastered the art of rocking Eleanor to sleep, and even found joy in the small moments, like the way her tiny hand would curl around his finger. Clara, too, rediscovered parts of herself she thought she had lost. With James' encouragement, she began teaching art classes again, balancing her passion with the demands of motherhood. Together, they created a life that felt messy and imperfect, but profoundly real. One evening, as they walked through the park near their home, James stopped suddenly. Clara, holding Eleanor in her arms, turned to him with a questioning look. "What is it?" she asked. James took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Clara," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I've made so many mistakes in my life, but the one thing I got right was loving you. Even when I didn't show it the way I should have, even when I didn't deserve you, that never changed." Clara's eyes filled with tears as he knelt before her, pulling out a small velvet box, not for the bracelet this time, but for a ring. "I don't want to live another day without you by my side," he said. "Not just as Eleanor's mother, but as my partner, my equal, my everything. Will you marry me?" "Again?" Clara's breath hitched, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked at James, at the man who had hurt her but also fought so hard to change, and then at their daughter, a symbol of everything they had built together. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, James." Cheers erupted from nearby strangers in the park, but James only had eyes for Clara. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for her forgiveness, but for the chance to start again. A year later, James and Clara stood together in their backyard, surrounded by friends and family, as they renewed their vows. The ceremony was simple, filled with laughter and love, a reflection of the life they had built. Eleanor toddled through the grass, her giggles echoing through the air as James scooped her up, spinning her in his arms. Clara watched them, her heart full, knowing that while their journey had been far from easy, it had been worth every step. Their story wasn't about perfection or fairy tales. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and the beauty of starting over. And as they stood together, hand in hand, they knew that this was only the beginning of the life they would create together. Life doesn't always give us the chance to rewrite our mistakes, but when it does, it takes courage to seize it. James and Clara's journey wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and choosing love, even after everything seemed lost. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to rebuild, to grow, and to create something beautiful from the broken pieces. If this story moved you or gave you hope, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another story like this. Let's continue sharing these moments that inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.